Okay, well, it turns out this little series on the Venus Project is going to be longer than 2 parts because it's just going to take more time to go through all of the falsehoods that form the foundation of the Venus Project and the new zeitgeist, quote, movement, close quote. And I'm going to be reading this off of a text, so you're going to see my eyes going across like this, and I'm not going to be looking into the camera. But I just have to do that because otherwise these videos are going to get too long, and people have a short attention span. They have other things to do, so I'm just going to be scripting these from now on, and I'm going to be looking into the camera and reading them, and you're going to see me reading them. So, whatever. First, let's deal with the invisible hand. Venus projectors refer to the invisible hand portrayed by Adam Smith as faith in the market as God. That is the belief that the invisible hand is just a secularization of a belief that God orders everything in a divinely harmonious fashion. Now, Adam Smith only used the term invisible hand one time in his entire book, Wealth of Nations. And let's reread that famous line that people refer to all the time. Quote, "By preferring the support of domestic to that of foreign industry, he intends only his own security. And by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain. And he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was not part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. I have never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good. It is an affectation, indeed, not very common among merchants, and very few words need to be employed in dissuading them from it." So the idea is that through trade, the resulting creation of industry, people do more good for others than by trying to help others directly. But many believe, and this is actually something that Jack Fresco alluded to, pointing about how Mother Teresa wasn't doing very much good, whereas the scientist who invented the new agricultural techniques that increase agricultural yields fivefold will be doing much more. Now, Jack Fresco wouldn't say that this is something good from the market, that this is something good from technology, although I would then say, well, the reason that people will try to figure out these new things is partly because of the great amount of wealth they will gain by increasing agricultural yields fivefold, which will also have the effect of helping other people. But many think that this idea is religious. That is, it's a religious faith in the markets, and that it is market fundamentalists who believe this. Well, we can look at the market as an evolutionary environment. As firms that are able to get money to cover their expenses win out over firms that do not. Okay, this is true. This is pretty clear-cut. I don't see how anyone can really argue against this. For now, I know that many Venus projectors will say that firms get their money mainly by undue means, and that they would also get their money by undue means, even in a totally free market. But even, let's just for the sake of argument, let's assume all that is true. Let's assume that firms are not helping society or anything like that. But even if we assume all of that, we can recognize that it is indeed an evolutionary environment. Firms that, if you think that that firms survive based on their ability to bribe senators, then firms that are able to bribe senators will win out over firms that aren't able to bribe senators. So it is still, even then, it is an evolutionary environment. Now, we may disagree on what those evolutionary forces are, but there are, in fact, evolutionary forces creating a survival of the fittest kind of thing. And this is juxtaposed to the idea of central planning, where the state commands resources to be allocated in what they claim is the optimal fashion. That is, an entity outside the market, or I would go so far as to say most people view it as being above the market, intervenes in the evolutionary process of the market. So I'm sorry, even if you hate the market for whatever reasons you believe, it's obvious that the invisible hand is an evolutionary metaphor, while the iron fist of the state is a much more congruent parallel to the notion of religious divine intervention. And as more evidence comes in on the formation of early states, the conquest theory of state formation, and mainly when we're talking about the conquest theory, we're talking about Carnier's circumscription theory of state formation. That's losing out to the Dutch school, the ideology theory of state formation. And that's the idea that states forming de novo came not primarily from strong men and force of arms, but primarily through religious support of the state. That is, the state was an outgrowth of dominant religious beliefs. And this would have, say, and there would be, say, 90% support of a state, right? People believing that the pharaoh is the intermediary of God's will or whatever. And that 90% support, that's enough to pay for an army, which can then force the remaining unbelievers to tithe to the state or the church or whatever, which was the same thing early on. And early on, those who didn't believe in the dominant religion also didn't accept the initial justifications for the state. And so atheism was synonymous with anarchism, or holding religious beliefs different from that which justified the state. And I would refer to the work of Henry Clausen on this point. Now, states, of course, evolved, and the justifications changed over time, but it's still ideology. And even today, there's still the implicit theism in that people will question the market, but assume that a state solution, a state intervention, will go mostly according to plan. That is, the market is this crazy thing, but the state intervention is fixed and static. Right? So advocates of free markets have to defend the market or how a free market would be in reality, while a statist gets to conjure up their ideal state. So I have to argue reality against a statist who gets to argue about, well, you have to argue against my ideal state. Right? And that comes from this kind of, I would say it's an implicit theism. It's not explicit, because if people knew that this is what they were doing, they'd stop doing it. Anyway, the next idea that I ran into is planned obsolescence. Now, I haven't read much into direct arguments about planned obsolescence, but I don't think I need to. And I'd like to give two responses to this idea. The first issue is that in a free market, competition makes the strategy of planned obsolescence very difficult, because if you hold back on features of a product to where it will become obsolete very quickly, all a competitor has to do is include all of those features in their product, and they will win out, right? Assuming that the consumers are reasonably well informed, knowing that that if one company is engaging in a program of planned obsolescence and another company is not, then the company that is not engaging in a program of planned obsolescence will win out, assuming well-informed consumers. Now, if either of these things aren't true, that the consumers aren't reasonably well-informed and or the market is not competitive, then firms can sell shoddier products for the same price and still get customers. And planned obsolescence, it's just another form of shoddiness. You don't need to have any... There's not a new type of analysis that you have to come up with to deal with planned obsolescence. Now, firms cartelizing may be able to do this. Have a program of planned obsolescence. That is, all of the electronics firms get together and agree to sell products that are planned to be obsolete when they could sell products that would last longer for roughly the same price. Now, cartels are systematically unstable if there isn't a natural monopoly, because the point of cartels is to increase profits, right? But when you increase profits, that attracts investment. And the more profitable an industry is, the more investors want to go into that industry. Right? Think of it like almost a chemical attraction, that investors are attracted to profits. So when a cartel forms and earns profits, that sends a signal, right? The profit signal to investors to invest in that industry. And all these investors investing in that industry will create new firms that then compete with the cartel. And so the cartel is broken because it's now competitive. And so the cartel must now compete and lower prices / raise quality or whatever, or stop the planned obsolescence thing, whatever it is they have to do to compete. Now today, it's hard for the little guy to enter markets because various barriers to entry, and I'm not going to get into examples of that. The problem with barriers to entry is that there's no one big thing you can point to. It's just tons and tons and tons of little dickish regulations, and they all pile up Maybe I'll link to something about the 10,000 commandments acting as a barrier to entry. Anyway, but the thing is, even today, large firms can overcome barriers to entry, and very large firms can be formed very quickly through the corporation. That is, a bunch of investors buy stock in a corporation that is then, as big as Walmart, right away, and it then has the bulk to deal with all the bullshit regulations and can compete with the big boys right away. So even though the little guys is shut out of today's market, cartels can still be broken today because capital markets can amass and form really large firms really, really fast. But another thing to keep in mind is that planned obsolescence is not always a bad thing. Let's take home electronics. A firm may recognize that in 5 years, an electronic device that they're selling will become obsolete. Now, they could use high-quality components for this product, or they could use low-quality components that will probably break in about 5 years. And higher-quality components, of course, will cost more. As a manufacturer, do you sell this product with higher-quality components, which will make the product more expensive, or lower-quality components, which will make it cheaper for the customer? And there's no a priori correct answer for this. Now, one could say that firms shouldn't do this. They shouldn't release new electronic gizmos that only have a tiny advancement, and that they should wait until more substantial improvements are made. But this is just your opinion. It's just a matter of opinion, what is a more substantial improvement or not. But the way we can kind of tell if, say, electronics manufacturers are engaging in unnecessary planned obsolescence to boost profits is to ask, well, how much profits are these companies actually making? Well, we can look at the profit margins by industry, and I'll have those linked in the description, and what you'll find is that the financial and medical industries have the highest profit margins aside from basic materials, and that technology is actually in fourth. But it's hard to tell if technology and consumer goods are in the same category or what. And from this, it doesn't look like the program of planned obsolescence is having that big of an effect. Even if you think planned obsolescence is responsible for all of the profits from the tech industry and all the profits from the consumer goods industry, at most it only comes out to about 9%. And that's before they have to pay their taxes. The next idea I want to deal with is the idea that people today think they can grow human civilization forever. And this is not true because the Earth is finite. Now, this is just another example of Venus projectors lacking a theory of mind, or lacking a respect for other people's ideas, right? Thinking that they're the only ones who have any nuance of thought. Now, let's recall the classic examples of Britain and Mesopotamia, and I'm not going to link these because you should just know this. In Mesopotamia and in Britain, when they reached the limit of how much food could be produced in an area, food prices got higher, which made it more expensive to raise children, and so people had smaller families. The next generation was thus smaller, and so fewer people were growing crops on this sub-marginal land, meaning that the food production per capita was higher, and so it was cheaper to have a family, because food was cheaper, and so people would have larger families. Then these larger families, as a result, consumed more food, meaning that they had to go into more marginal areas to produce what little extra food they could get, and this resulted in less food production per capita, resulting in higher food prices, resulting in smaller families for the next generation. And this cycle kept going over and over. Britain's population would fluctuate like between 6 and 8 million or something like that. Before industrial agriculture, Britain's population would be between 6 and 8 million, and it would just oscillate back and forth because of the shift in food prices based on the population. And this is what will happen on a global scale when global human population reaches that point. And we know this simply by mapping incentives. The next idea I want to deal with is the wealth inequality that is brought up. And this is not something unique to the new Zeitgeist movement or the Venus Project, but it's about how, say, 50% of the wealth is owned by 1% of the world's population, or whatever it is. I don't remember specifically what it is. And here I want to explain why that doesn't matter, and why it wouldn't even matter if 100% of the wealth was owned by 1% of the world's population. First, imagine the Soviet Union, where most things were centrally planned. Now, in the Soviet Union, most people were working in factories and farms and construction or whatever, with only a small portion that made up the state planning and direction of this production. Right? Very poorly because they lack price information, but that's another topic. And if you're interested in this, I have a linked blog post explaining the economic situation of the USSR. Now, the state owned everything. So we could say that the planners and directors owned everything in the Soviet Union, which would be like 1% of the population owning 80% of the wealth in the Soviet Union. And I say 80% because even in the USSR, where the market was outlawed, the market economy was still at around like 20% of GDP, if I recall correctly. Now, I don't know what the real numbers are of the central planners in the USSR, what percentage of the population they made up. But the point is, to say that they owned all of the wealth is misleading. Now, a capitalist is just a planner. Not a central planner, but an emergent or evolved planner of industry. Right? Because a capitalist is organizing resources and is going to be rewarded with a profit or punished with a loss based on how he can manage those resources. So he is a planner of the structure of production, but one that comes about through his ability to figure out what people want and figure out how to provide that in an economical way. Now, let's say you own a factory, meaning that you are, an emergent planner of the structure of production. But what actually do you get? Well, your income comes from profits, and this is dependent on how much society values the inputs to your industry and how much society values the outputs from your industry. The price of wood, the price of electricity, the price of labor, right? All this is determined by the interactive preferences of all of the relevant society. And the price of what is produced is also determined by the interactive preferences of all of society. You don't get to decide how much an iPod is worth, right? The customers decide. And you don't get to decide how much the inputs of an iPod is worth. You have to pay people. They all decide, right? The people you're buying it from decide. Now, those who can guide resources in a manner approved by society will earn a profit. Those who fail are punished with a loss. But even then, even in a firm that earns a profit, there is consumer surplus, right? That is, because when you buy something, your expectation is that you value the item more than what you paid for it. And however much this is, however much you value the item more than what you paid for it, that is your consumer surplus. Now, some may say that this process today is perverted by the state, and I would say kind of, right? Because states rest on support, and practically states that rest on force alone don't last. And so a state is just a product of the will of society. And so if a firm buys off some senators, well, he's just interacting with the fantasy structure of society, that is the state. But I digress here. Anyway, the capitalist gets profits, and after-tax profits across all industry in the U.S. has been around 6% since like 1950. So you own a factory. So what? If the factory that you own is breaking even, then your income as capitalist will be zero. You'll have zero. Right? Now, that factory that you own could be the only employer in town. And so in that town, it would be said that you own 80% of the wealth, because the factory represented 80% of the wealth. But if that factory is just breaking it even, then you'll be completely penniless. Even though you own 80% of the wealth, you'll be completely penniless. Okay? So to say that 1% of the population owns 40% of the wealth, what does that even mean? Right? They earn a lot of profits from the companies that they own, but even the profits don't all go directly to them. Right? The profits need to be reinvested. A lot of the profits have to go towards various small-time shareholders. Some of the profits go to taxes. And even, the income that the capitalists and the captains of industry get, how much of this actually goes on buying a bunch more mansions or buying a bunch more yachts, as opposed to going to various foundations. And Bill Gates has more money than he knows what to do with, so he's just giving tons of it away. Now, as a capitalist, if your services are not needed, that is, if the services of a planner are not needed, then you will slowly be phased out. And this is because a capitalist costs money. And if an industry doesn't need a capitalist, then a capitalist is just dead weight and makes that company less competitive. Whereas a firm who doesn't have a capitalist, or has a capitalist that takes less of a paycheck, that firm has more money to work with. And this dynamic is seen in how older, more established industries have lower profits, i.e. lower wages for capitalists than newer industries. And this makes sense because newer industries have more planning to do and hence more need for a capitalist. So that's the function of the capitalist, and why 1% of the population owning half of the wealth doesn't really mean what most people think it means. Okay, that does it for this. Stay tuned for more videos going over arguments made by the New Venus Project, or the New Zeitgeist Movement and the Venus Project.